We are saying happy birthday to an Emmy-winning journalist and an author, Jeff Greenfield. He has been a correspondent for CBS and a speechwriter for politicians like Robert Kennedy Sr. He's also written many books, and among them, the one, Then Everything Changed.
In it, he looks at events that came a breath away from actually happening and how they would have changed history. Our Rob Caldwell spoke with him in 2011 and found Greenfield starts off the book with an event that very few people know about.
What really happened was that John Kennedy came seconds away from being killed by a suicide bomber outside his home in Palm Beach, Florida. And you're quite right, this has gone totally forgotten by history. The man's name was Richard Pavlik. He was an anti-Catholic, deranged person, had a car loaded with dynamite. And only because Jacqueline Kennedy came to the door to bid Jack off when he went to church did Richard Pavlik say, I don't want to do this in front of his wife and family. Seconds away, said the Secret Service chief, from losing John Kennedy. So in this book, all I do is have Jacqueline Kennedy, she's had a difficult childbirth for John Jr. She doesn't come to the door, and Richard Pavlik blows up the president-elect, and we have Lyndon Johnson as president through many events, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the key for me was to do a lot of research, talking to one of his top aides, reading oral histories and tapes, talking to Doris Kearns Goodwin, one of his biographers, to find out how he might have reacted, what he would have brought to that decision-making. And what the book suggests is we would have had a very different conclusion to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which ended peacefully, very close to a nuclear confrontation, because we would have had John Kennedy not president and Lyndon Johnson with his very different character and personality as president.
What you've written is a what if. It's fiction, but you have woven a lot of fact through there, including words that the historical figures actually said. Tell me how you did that.
Well, let's take another example. I have Robert Kennedy in June of 1968 saved from Sirhan's gun by, again, a small twist of fate. Now, I worked for Robert Kennedy. I was a young aide and a junior speechwriter. But what I tried to do to make this plausible was to say, all right, what would Robert Kennedy have said in a presidential campaign that went on? And I think you'll see the simplicity of this. I took words he actually said. And for instance, and this will shock, I think, a lot of conservatives and liberals, Robert Kennedy was a big critic of big government. He thought the federal government had gotten too big. He was not a conservative by any stretch of the imagination, but he wanted power brought back to localities. He thought the federal government was too distant. He didn't like public welfare. He wanted jobs. He thought the public education system was not going to be solved by money. So one of the things I've tried to do in that section, by taking his real words and putting them in the mix of a much longer and successful presidential campaign, is to try to show how our history might have been very different if someone with Robert Kennedy's very unconventional views about a lot had actually wound up as president.
As you mentioned, you worked for Robert Kennedy as a speechwriter. You liked and admired him. What was it like writing that part of the book and speculating about what might have happened, how things would have turned out differently if Bobby Kennedy had not been assassinated?
Well, you're right. Part of it must have been a kind of therapy for me, because I've been asked, and anybody who's worked for Robert Kennedy at much higher levels has been asked what would have happened, and we've always said we don't know. And I thought, all right, first and last, let's try. But I don't make it all sweetness and light. I mean, it may surprise some of your viewers to know that somebody who greatly admires Robert Kennedy still thinks that there was the possibility of something not unlike a Watergate happening in his administration, which actually happens in the book with very different results. But it was a very emotional experience at times to try to imagine him whistle-stopping through states he never lived to get through. That was probably the most emotionally intense part of the writing. You
make it clear that the stories that you tell here are meant to be entertaining, they're meant to be thought-provoking, but there are certain people who say there are no what-ifs in history. What happens, happens, and the rest of it is just pure fantasy. What would you say to those folks?
I would say it sounds like they're quoting Omar Khayyam, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, and all your tears can't change a whit of it. That's not as eloquent. But all I'm saying is, well, no, they're not inevitable. If it had rained in Dallas one day longer, the bubble top would have been on top of John Kennedy's limousine, rather than him riding in an open car. And nobody can tell me that history wouldn't have been very different. So I don't disagree that there are these great moving factors in history, ideology, climate, but fate's a role.
Greenfield recently released a thematic follow-up asking what would have happened if other famous moments in history had never happened, like what if Japan hadn't struck Pearl Harbor or the Beatles had never formed.